Yeah. Okay, guys. We're gonna start. We're gonna start. Can you hear me? Okay. So this week we're going to discuss the state formation and the concept of the nation-state formation and the history of the nation-state formation from a global perspective. Okay? So this is the layout of the lectures. We are going to start out with the major feature or the main landmark of state formation that officially started with the ratification of the Treaty of Westphalia and with the prime focus on the emergence of a nation-state or the modern state in Western Europe. And we are going to investigate or interrogate further, what we mean by the modern state and to what extent, the history of the emergence of state or the nation-state in Europe would be applicable or resonate with the global south or non-European context. So in order to investigate the state formation and the history of the state formation, we need to know first what do we mean by state. So we will examine the major or the main theoretical approaches that offered some sort of answers to some puzzling questions about the nature of the state and the relationship between state, economy, and society, and the processes and the causes involved in the state formation. So we're going to investigate the Weberian approaches and neo-Weberian traditions that emanated from the Weberian notion of the modern state, and then the Marxist and post-Marxist traditions, and the liberal approaches and the post-structural structural approaches to state building. And then we will try to understand what do we mean by nation state, or what constitutes actually national identity. Is it natural, or it has something to do with the cultural construct, or it's a function of pre-existing some sort of macro-structural elements or components. And then we try to understand why history matter and why we should bring like politics and history back into the analysis of the state formation, and how anti-colonial struggle in the global south was part and parcel of this conception, or for the formation of the national identity or the nation state building. And we are going to look deeper into this in the seminar discussion. So you have like 3 readings that they focus primarily on 3 different cases, like Brazil, South Africa, and Palestine. And then we are going to conclude with whether or not, the globalization, with this blurring boundaries between what's national and what's transnational or what's international, led to changes to the conception of the stateness, or led to some sort of transformation of the state, tying this back to the 4 analytical approaches or theoretical approaches that bear on the conception of the conceptualization of the state and the formation of the processes of the formation of the nation state. So before we start out, how did this notion of modern state emerge? Yeah, Jude?
Colonialism? Yes. How did it emerge? They were constructed.
The modern state formation.
All right, yeah.
How can we trace it historically?
Borders.
Sorry?
Borders.
Who's talking?
Borders.
Yeah?
And population.
Okay. How did it emerge in Western Europe?
The Treaty of Westphalia, which I
Yeah?
wish I could remember more about, but they kind of...
So let's start. What's modern? What do you mean by modern in this modern state?
Is it the separation of church and state?
Okay. And what else?
Centralized. Highly centralized.
Centralization. Yeah. Yeah. Good point. So basically, human beings witness different or various forms of political organization since the advent of this settled agriculture. So people came together in order to develop some sort or invent some sort of political organization in order to organize their daily activities and advance their livelihoods. But with the emergence, the state, as a modern, political organization, it became it emerged as a predominant model of political organization that will organize, the relationship between authority and people or the population, and would organize the relation between different segments in society. And the standard biography of the modern state, started with the ratification of the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Do you know what were the main pillars of this treaty? Anyone? Yeah, Camila?
State should recognize themselves as states, so they're independent what we developed years.
Yeah. So basically, as Camila mentioned, it recognized, this notion of sovereignty. That is the mutual respect or the guarantee of these territorial boundaries. So each state, had to respect, the territorial integrity of the other states. It actually put an end to these decades of wars between different territorial expansion in Western European region, and that's why it was a recognition of this conception of sovereignty. And it came with this idea of tolerance as well, how they put an end to this conception of cultural homogeneity that led to ethnic cleansing in some areas, mainly like what's known today as Spain. It put an end to this ethnic, cleansing and cultural homogeneity by tolerating, the minorities. So the minority groups should be tolerated, and in return, they should give their political loyalty to the political authority, or these geographically territorial or geographically bounded territories. So the very notions about tolerance of the religious minorities and sovereignty, they came with the Treaty of Westphalia. So what was the rationale behind the emergence of the state in Western Europe? So the central or the underlying logic here is in order to end this warfare or these decades of bloody wars in Europe, the state or these political entities or empires, they had to impose some sort of taxes on their population in order to mobilize some resources and deploy forces and acquire technological military technology in order to finance their expansionist policies. So this kind of international war or international military conflict led to the emergence of a state in a sense of centralized, administrative structure. So the state, in order to finance the war and mobilize resources, it did need some sort of extractive machinery to collect taxes and to finance the war. So that's why the rationale was to centralize political authority in order to finance the war activities. And this the argument, the very famous argument made by Kelly, wars make state and states make war. And the imposition of conscription as well, so the political leadership or political rulers, they had to negotiate or they had to bargain and to reach a compromise with their own citizens in order to with the soldiers mainly, so they had to give them some sort of public goods provisions and political rights in order to gain their deployment in the army and to finance the war machinery as well. So the rationale was war was very these kind of international military conflict or international interstate conflicts were essential to centralize power and to create this kind of centralized bureaucratic apparatuses in Western Europe. So any critique to this argument? So do you think this is reasonable and applicable even in Europe, across all time periods? Okay, so first of all, it was not a general pattern about this kind of war didn't necessarily lead to centralization of authority or didn't pave the way. Or can you hear me? Really? Guys, can you hear me? Okay. So can you come and sit down here, please, in the front? No? Okay, so I'll try, yeah. Okay, so basically, it was not a general pattern, in Europe, even in Europe across all the times. So some writings would argue that the processes before the middle of the 15th century after the middle of the 15th century was totally different because of different reasons, because of the expansion of the European universities that led to change of people's view regarding the merit-based administrative structure and this kind of assuming government office or the model of government was no longer related to personal ties or related to this kind of personal relationship with the political rulers. It was based more on meritocratic criteria. And that was because of the role of the education and the expansion of the European universities. So it has something to do with the changing of people's view regarding public office and the model of government, not necessarily related to the war and the extractive power of the state that led to the centralization of power. And even inside Europe, for example, we have like different, like divergent trajectories of state building. In France, for example, it was not the war that led to the centralization of power. So there are other variables that related to elite orientation or elite ideologies or the protective coalitions, for example. In France, the king and the bourgeoisie, the class, they have like, they have like main preference, like they share the same political preference of centralization of power. They prefer to structure authority along, these kind of territorial boundaries rather than kinship and personal ties, in contrary to like feudal elites and clergy, for example. So it has something to do with elite orientation and political orientation, and less to do with the war machine. So the king imposed taxes on bourgeoisie that they accepted to pay these taxes in order to contribute to the efforts of the centralization of power. In the Dutch state, for example, or the Netherlands, it was like the patrimonial structure of the state in the 15th and 16th century. It was related to with the military power. So the patrimonial and the personal ties didn't lead to, didn't weaken the military capacity of the state. It was the opposite way around. When they started to rely on local elites or local estates, it led to the fragmentation of power. So centralization weakened, the military capacity of the state rather than hint on or impinged upon the military capacity of the state. So you had like to pay attention about the generalizations, that it was not like a general pattern across different countries in Western European region and across all the times, even in Europe. Let alone like the patterns of state building in non-European countries or the global south. In Latin America, for example, and as we are going to see in the seminar, it has nothing to do with wars. It has more to do with the fragmentation of power or the in society and the relationship between political rulers and different social forces or different social elements, as we are going to investigate the case of Brazil in the seminar. So that's why like elite ideologies, elite coalitions, protective coalitions between different elements of the ruling class or the ruling elements in these states were essential variables or essential factors when it comes to the centralization of power. Okay? If I ask you in your head, if I ask you what is the state, how are you going to answer? What's the state?
It's a kind of manipulation to form a very comprehensive bureaucracy and to establish the functions under certain structures inside this place, and this place is called the state.
So some sort of set of administrative organizations that will be like in charge of public goods provisions or making some sort of binding or collectively binding decision making. Okay? What else? Okay, so try to think about it. This is exactly what the Weberian approaches or Weberian traditions would say. So Max Weber actually defined the state as this kind of set of administrative and coercive organizations that it actually did monopolize the legitimate use of physical force, and they together they made these binding decisions. So they actually promulgate laws, and citizens we have to abide by these laws. So from Max Weber definition of the state as a set of organizations, like administrative and coercive organizations. Some neo-Weberian approaches emerged from this broader, umbrella of defining the state through or by organizational logic. And they mentioned like we have to put, we have to actually read carefully, the Weberian tradition by examining the relationship between these organizations, the state as like, set of organizations, and society or some sort of political actors that actually any charge or responsible for making these decisions. And from these traditions, they emerged, like some scholars, they investigate, the autonomy or the embedded autonomy of the state or the decision makers or the political actors who are in charge of making decisions. They enjoy some degree of autonomy from society. They have some sort of ties with political actors or social and non-state actors, but they enjoy some degree of autonomy to make these decisions or these binding decisions, and they formulate independent policies. And Peter Evans mentioned this as embedded autonomy. So the state, like political actors or officials, they can make decisions through political ties in order to make some informed decisions, but they are still autonomous when it comes to making these decisions. This is very important because they differentiate themselves from the Marxist and neo-Marxist traditions, by the way. So by reading well, or reading carefully the Weberian tradition, so what Max Weber actually mentioned, he was offered some sort of sociological foundation of politics. What he tried to, the argument, he tried to articulate was mainly how the emergence of modern capitalism in Western European region led to the spread of rationality. It changes the distribution of power between different political, different social forces and different social groups. And with these changes in the distribution of power, it came the notion of reorganization and restructuring, the power relation or the political authority and society relation along rational bureaucratic apparatuses. So he had something, to do with the sources of authority and political legitimacy that are based on rational bureaucratic organization of the political authority rather than primordial or primitive or charismatic sources of legitimacy. Okay, so you have to, it's not only a set of organizations, but you have to put, this in interaction or in interactive relationship with different social elements, or to offer some sort of sociological foundation of the state as well. And another perception of the nature of the state and the relationship between the state and society, it came with or rooted in the Marxist tradition. Do you have any idea what Marx and Marxist traditions would say about the state? Anyone? Okay, so it's basically starting with Marx. Actually, he mentioned the state. They articulate this argument about the embeddedness of the state into the economy. So the state is not autonomous from the capitalist class. It is just an instrument, at the hands of the capitalist class in order to achieve, the capital accumulation and to guarantee their economic interest. From these traditions, so the class conflict and this capitalist mode of production would help us understand the emergence of the modern state in order to preserve, to make sure, or to facilitate this capital accumulation task and to serve the interests of the capitalist, the powerful capitalist class. And some other traditions actually emanated from Marx's tradition. They moved away from this economic and structural determinism, and they mentioned that the state is not necessarily an instrument or means, in the hands of the capitalist class in order to achieve their own interests, but it's still, we need to put it in relational terms, like the relationship between the capitalist or the powerful classes in society and the state itself, or as officials or decision makers, as political actors or some sort of models of government. So Polanzis, for example, he talked about condensed social relations. So the state, you can perceive the state. This is the definition of the state or the nature of the state. It's kind of class relations. Capitalist class, who are the more powerful, they have access to decision-making circles or agencies, and they can, push for. They have access to physical resources in order to guarantee their own economic interest. And Jason, for example, he mentioned that, it's still state as a structure, but these political actors and political officials and social classes, they had access to some powerful classes, they have access to some resources in order to guarantee the articulation or the formulation of specific decisions and specific policies. So in order to understand the emergence and the powerful of the sources of the strength of the capitalist state, you need to investigate these kind of class relations and the conflict between different classes in order to understand why the capitalist state is very powerful and why it guarantees consent to each power, why it would make binding decisions, and why people would abide by, would offer some sort of legitimacy to its policies or to and abide by its own laws. We are going to investigate this more next week, but with this economic globalization, some scholars rooted in these traditions, they talk about the transformation of the state by they still they have this condensed class relation, but they brought into the analysis the transnational economic powers, like the multinational corporations or transnational corporations as main pivotal actor that would account for or to help you understand the power of the capital state, or the persistence or the endurance of the capital state. So they perceive the state from this embeddedness conception, economic embeddedness conception, and this condensed class relation. Okay. The other analytical or theoretical approach, they perceive the state or the emergence of the modern state as a result of some macro-structural changes that came with the modernization and the increasingly differentiated division of labor. For example, the industrialization and the mass education, it actually obliged the state to build legal infrastructure in order to protect some industries and some private businesses or private enterprises, and to offer or to organize this mass education or to establish some sort of schools and universities. So they need some sort of political authority in order to align itself with these new modernization, new modernized techniques, or the new competitive politics between different social groups. So the point here, the state is not an instrument, in the hands of the capitalist class. It actually it's made up of some sort of diverse social groups. They are, according to them, they compete equally over the question of who gets what, and over making rules, binding decisions, and legal rules and legal and formal regulations that would organize the relationship between different parts in society. So according to them, the state would function because it would offer, the only source of public goods provision, and basically the fiscal security. And by offering, these kind of services and offering, security and public goods, to its own citizens, so it would retain some sort of legitimacy, and people would legitimize this authority and would abide by their laws and regulations. Anything is missing here? Perceiving the state as a set of organizations, as class relationship between government and officials, politicians, and capitalists class or like multiplicities as like a strategic arena between different groups competing equally in kind of an even, political field in order to gain access to resources. What's missing here with the definition of the state?
People who make the state.
Yeah. So it's basically something related to this. Like post-structuralist approaches, they mention something about we need to pay attention to the ideologies and the discourses and the culture that would help people legitimize the state authority. What would confer legitimacy to this use of force? Why people would abide by the laws? Why people would legitimize it's okay for them, for the military establishment or the military institution to crack down on some segments of society while refusing non-state actors to deploy forces or to use violence against their fellows or against citizens or against population. So Timothy Mitchell mentioned something like state is not like a material organization. We need to perceive it. We need to understand the techniques and the discourses that would make citizens see or recognize, the state structure appearing as a state structure. And he mentioned that this is kind of a discursive produced effects. And highlighting the role of the schooling system and the laws, for example, by telling people what to do and what not to do, what's the right thing to do and what's not the right thing that would you get penalized, if you do this, if you transgress these boundaries. So these kind of techniques, like the state used from issuing passports, you need to get a certificate, of birth or death. These kind of everyday practices would make a state not a freestanding object, located outside society. It has something to do with the discursive practices that produce effect, and it made it part and parcel of the non-material, the very existence of the daily of the very existence of your daily life. Okay, so the role of the discursive practices is very important. Others would argue that it's about symbolic and cultural construct as well. So you need yours, for example, mentioned about the cultural framing. So the state has to have some sort of master narrative, like national liberation struggle, the role of the army in Asia, for example, in some Asian countries and in the Middle East, in liberating the country in their anti-colonial struggle and forcing colonial powers to depart from their own countries. So they need these kind of master narrative, and they establish some sort of rituals and celebrating events and practices, and getting people engaged in these theatrical performance, in staging politics. It's part and parcel of the conception of the state as well. So people need some sort of symbolic meaning and cultural construct in order to, that was essential for the emergence and the perpetuation of the state. So the state here is not material, it's not you cannot perceive it as only material organizations or certain political actors making political or binding decisions. It has more to do with these narratives, rituals and ceremonies, and the staging of politics, and getting citizens involved into these practices in order to perpetuate its own power and its own legitimacy. So again, related to this, the discipline effect, you define the state with its own disciplining effect and moral control through the legal system by telling you what's the right thing to do, and you have to abide by these laws. So it's kind of non-forcible techniques in order to have a cognitive image, of the state as part and parcel of your daily life. Okay. So do you see, these four approaches are mutually exclusive, or they complement each other in a way? Material organizations, class relations in relation to officials or power holders, different competition between different groups that would they have impact or effect on decision making and allocation of resources, and discourses, ideologies, these kind of techniques and practices that became like part and parcel of the day, actually imprinted or instilled in the cognitive maps of its own citizens. Yeah, okay, they are not mutually exclusive. So you need you need organizations in order to make decisions and to monopolize this legitimate use of force, but you need as well cultural elements and cultural symbols in order to legitimize, these actions and these decisions, and to make, this public representation of the state organization. It's also as like a set of organizations that they are not separable from conflict between different groups and conflict between different elite coalitions or changing, of the elite alliances that would account for the allocation of resources and changing, the bureaucratic apparatuses. So they are not mutually exclusive. You need like material and non-material elements in order to understand, the state. The emergence of the state, the nature of the state, the relation between the state and society and economy. And here are the processes, and causes involved, in the emergence or in the formation of the nation state. So if I ask you what constitutes like national identity, what would actually like bind people, what would create this kind of bond between different, individuals, that we have like this collectively held image that we belong and relate to this geographically bounded territory. Where does nationalism come from? No, you have to answer.
A common history.
Sorry?
A common history.
Part of history?
A common history between people.
History between people, like shared history?
Yeah, the shared history.
Shared history between people, yeah? Language, yeah? Yeah. So exactly, like, Gellner mentioned like something about like, this congruence between ethnicity when it comes to like shared experiences, shared language, like these kind of like ethnicity and ethnic boundaries and political boundaries, they were like, they used to be congruent in order to create, this nation. Okay? But again, like, they have like different like theoretical underpinnings to understand, what constitutes this identity. Because, for example, like people might share same language, but they have like different like experiences. So that's why they might have these kind of separatist inclination. Okay, so they might have different identity that they don't relate, to these boundaries. For example, in the Middle East, like Sunni and Shia, for example. So they have like the same religion, but perhaps like, they have like some sort of other divisions. They speak the same language, and they have like the same religion from like, same ethnicity, but, they have like, this kind of separatist inclination. So there are like, different interpretation you can be critical of. People would argue that this kind of national identity is primordial. So they follow, this evolutionary biologist argument that it's our brain is like hardwired. It's hardwired into our brain. So it's part and parcel of our nature. So you cannot imagine, there's kind of a control of like political ideas and shaping of the world around you. So the state is part of this. So you cannot imagine your existence without, the existence of political authority that would offer organization and advancement of the livelihoods of people. Others would say it's not. It's kind of culturally constructed. It's kind of, you can trace it historically. People have this historical inclination to herd together. They have like this inclination or leaning towards like cultural expression, and they need some sort of shared symbols and meaning in order to communicate effectively and meaningfully amongst each other. Others would argue that it's related to a structural pre-existing structural factors or determinants, like the modernization and the emergence of capitalism, for example. So these kind of industrialization and the emergence of the differentiated division of labor, differentiation and the new division of labor, and the mass education. Anderson made an argument regarding printed capitalism. So with this dissemination of new ideas, so people, developed, this collective image regarding, this relation and belonging to a certain community. So they have, this kind of imagination that they belong to one community, and they materialize, this community in political project, geographically demarcated political project. Okay, so when it comes to like the actual experiences, of non-European nations or non-European regions. So what do you think, what constituted national identity? Is it natural, or is it like a cultural construct, or it has something to do with the economic and social structure? Yeah? Sorry? Mm-hmm. This is what we are going to discuss in some detail in the seminar. Okay? So hopefully you should have done the reading, by the way. No? Okay. So the thing is, what we are trying to say, we are trying to put this, like, we need to avoid, this kind of the natural argument about, like, national identity. So we need to interrogate, the interaction between the structural and cultural construct by bringing history and politics into the analysis. So it's not ahistorical nor apolitical. So that's why we need to put, like, some cases, into political and historical context in order to understand how colonialism and anti-colonial struggle constituted, this national identity in different parts of the region. So, for example, like, perhaps I didn't list this in the readings, but I'm not sure if you have heard of Frantz Fanon, for example. He mentioned something about violence and how violence in sub-Saharan Africa or in countries was very played like a causal impact on the formulation of national identity. So people, like, colonized people, they found it liberating, to form guerrilla groups or to resort to armed struggles in order to liberate their country, and from the dynamics of this struggle constituted the conception of national identity. So the nationalism and the identity that they shared the same experiences, they have, like, some sort of sense of belonging to their lands or to their territories. It came from these dynamics and patterns of violent struggle against colonizers. So that's why we're going to investigate the sociological origins and the cultural constructs of national identity in non-European countries that help, like, to inculcate, this collective image of nation in different parts of the region. So you have, like, different patterns of anti-colonial struggle. So in some parts of the global south, it was like violent and revolutionary, and it left some durable, it had some sort of durable mark on the institutional configuration, as we are going to see. And in some other countries, it was like defensive in a way that post-colonial elites or national liberation, like leaders who led, or the national liberation struggle, they avoided this violence, anti-state violence, as it had been in Malaysia. Or like the anti-colonial struggle was like bloody in sub-Saharan Africa, and it did pit, like, different ethnic groups against each other, so it was degenerative and led to the eruption of the Second War. So that's why history and politics are very important in order to understand these dynamics and patterns of state formation, and how these dynamics and patterns led to left lasting marks on the institutional configuration or institutional arrangements and like stability of the patterns of the state-society relations. So that was the question we're going to link back in the seminar discussion. We're going to understand how these dynamics and patterns of anti-colonial struggle would help us understand the state in terms of like physical forces and ideological forces as well. So that's why we need to bring in the analysis the theoretical and the analytical approaches as well. So as a set of organizations and what kind of ideological and discursive practices anti-colonial struggle created in order to understand state formation in non-European regions. And how it led to like some sort of institutional legacies and patterns of a state-society relation, as I mentioned. And it helped us understand as well, like, you know, moving away or shifting away from this Eurocentric notion of modern state. In a way, we are going to see how colonial power or colonizers actually, they didn't like, you know, they were not committed to this very notion of tolerance towards minority. So it was like very selective. It was like tolerance in Western Europe that was related to Westphalia, but it was not people like in the global south on the former colonized regions. They had to be like, you know, civilized first in order to be tolerated. For example, like Algeria, French in Algeria, they dubbed, you know, the mission as a civilizing mission in order to civilize barbarians. So we need to shift or to pivot, you know, the focus away from the European experience in order, instead of consuming some sort of theories and approaches that actually emanate from the European experience and translate this into like, you know, non-European countries, we need to understand thoroughly or in some detail the dynamics of this anti-colonial struggle and how this actually led to or paved the way for different patterns of state formation and how this affected the state capacity and the patterns of the state-society relation in the post-colonial period. And the other target, you know, of this was, I'm not sure if you have heard of provincializing Europe as well. So instead of basing, instead of like having Europe as like a base benchmark against which, like, you know, every other nation, you know, had to modernize in order to reach. So they have this sense of lack or incompleteness in order to reach the modernity of Europe. So we need to understand how European powers appropriated, you know, this conception of civilness or modernity in order to establish their own modern state. So finally, like, in order to conclude, do you think that the globalization with these kind of blurring boundaries between national and transnational led to the collapse or changes of the conception of stateness and sovereignty? Or the state is still there?
Changes, but not collapse.
Yeah. Okay. Can you guess how the four analytical approaches would say about state transformation in the globalized era? So starting with the neo-Weberian traditions as a set of organizations and like some sort of political actors in charge of making binding decisions or autonomous decisions. What would they say? Okay, so the state is still there because the like even like, you know, transnational actors or MNCs, multinational corporations, they do need the state in order to facilitate their own business. So they need some sort of regulations. These regulations have to be made by the state in order to facilitate or to make them do their own businesses. So the state is always there, and they invented, you know, this conception of private-public partnership, the 3 Ps. Right? So the state is there, and you need to understand not only the dynamics of the globalization, so again, like bringing society into the analysis, you need to understand how people or citizens would perceive or push back against these globalization dynamics. So perhaps, when the state, diminishing role of the state would push citizens to resist, these policies and ask for more welfare provisions or more public goods provisions. So this is like, in order to understand the state in the age of the globalization, so you need to understand the processes of the decision making, and you need to bring citizen or society into the analysis as well. So again, balanced account between politics and the sociological foundation of political decisions. For the Marxist, the post-Marxist or the neo-Marxist, they would argue that still, there is a relation between decision-making circles, the national decision-making circles and transnational actors or class power outside the nation that actually transformed, the nature of the state and rescaled, the institutional configuration by. So they argue that the conflict now is not between the left and the right, it's between the national and the subnational. Meaning, if you have part of your national territory defined as an offshore industrial zone, for example, so you have MNC or international player that actually they have a say in the decision-making processes inside your own country, inside your own boundaries. So this conflict between national and international, it rescaled, the institutional configuration and the policy issues and the policy dimension as well. For the liberal, they are much more optimistic, and they did speak of this multi-level governance. You bring on new networks of players in the decision making, so the competition is still fair between different groups, and they have they all have a chance and opportunity to access state resources in order to make policies. But this is you can be critical of this, but this is what the liberal approach would say. And for the post-structuralists and culturalists, they would say this: you still need the state in order to project the idea or to project itself onto the new institutional configuration, producing some sort of discourses and practices and producing ideologies in order to guarantee its persistence, in the age of the globalization. So you can, in the global south, for example, if you analyze, the discourse of the state or the political leadership of the global south, you can hear of this conception of competitiveness, international competitiveness, effectiveness. So relegating, this discourse about state capitalism and national development, to the margin, and they replace these discourses, with this kind of international competitiveness in order to legitimize or to get people engaged, or being part and parcel of these discursive practices. But we have to invite MNCs and transnational actors because we need to be internationally competent and we need to cope with this international competition. So that's why we need to diminish, the role of the state, and we need to allocate, more resources or offer, some permissible business environment to invite, international capitalists or industrialists or transnational companies to come in and to invest in our countries. So there are the four analytical approaches that there, as a set of organizations, as class relations, as symbols or meanings and ideologies and practices. They are still there, but they adjusted the main elements or the main premises in order to adapt or to cope with the transformation that globalization brought about. Okay? Any question? Okay, so in the seminar, so we're going to discuss basically the three cases. Okay, we relate these cases. The three cases actually focus on the patterns of the anti-colonial struggle, on the dynamics of the anti-colonial struggle, and how this affected the formation of the state or the lack thereof in the case of Palestine. So you need to read them carefully and to link them to the four analytical approaches we talked about. How physical forces and ideological forces embedded into these anti-colonial struggle patterns affected the state formation in these countries. Okay? And you have some guiding questions in the syllabus in order to guide you through the discussions. I'll assign you randomly, so you'll be divided into 3 groups. Basically, you'll have to do the 3 readings, okay? Okay, see you on Friday.
Sorry. During the group is for the presentation.
We don't have presentations. It's small group discussions. Yeah. Hi there.
Sign up to presentation for this week, but are there no presentations?
Yeah, guys, sorry, there is no presentation. Okay, we will not have like individual presentations. It's a small group discussion. I'm also announcing.
So should I sign up for another week? But you're not going to require to do a presentation. Am I required to do another
It's clear? Yeah.